Is patriotism worth the cost? In the volatile landscape of 1980s Britain, this question haunts every intelligence operative. Michael Gilbert's The Killing of Michael Finnegan draws you into a high-stakes game where loyalty is fleeting and deception is currency. As seasoned agents Calder and Behrens race to thwart an IRA plot, they navigate a maze of half-truths and double-crosses. Gilbert's razor-sharp prose and intricate plotting keep you guessing until the final moment. Will the bomb go off? And who will it kill? The Killing of Michael Finnegan by Michael Gilbert. "They burned him to death," said Elf. He said it without any attempt to soften the meaning of what he was saying. He was almost certainly alive when they dumped him in the car and set fire to it. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Elf had a long, sad face and grey hair. In the 20 years that he'd been head of the Special Branch, he'd seen more brutality, more treachery, more fanaticism, more hatred than had any of his predecessors in war or in peace. Twice he'd had to retire, and twice he'd been persuaded to stay. "He couldn't have put up much of a fight," said Mr. Calder, only having one arm and 1.5 legs. They were talking about Michael Finnegan, whose charred carcass had been found in a burnt-out stolen car in one of the lonelier parts of Hampstead Heath. Finnegan had been a lieutenant in the Marines until he'd blown off his right arm and parts of his right leg whilst defusing a new type of anti-personnel mine. During his long convalescence, his wife Sheila had held the home together, supplementing Michael's disability pension by working as a secretary. Then Finnegan had taught himself to write left-handed and had gained a reputation and a reasonable amount of cash for his articles, first only in service journals but later in the national press, where he had constituted himself as a commentator on men and affairs. "It's odd," as Mr. Behrens once observed. "You think that he'd be a militant chauvinist. Actually, he seems to be a moderate and a pacifist. It was Finnegan who started arguing that we ought to withdraw our troops from Ireland. That was long before the IRA made it one of the main planks in their platform." "You can never tell how a serious injury will affect a man," said Mr. Calder. This was, of course, before he had become professionally involved with Michael Finnegan. "For the last year you've been acting as his runner, haven't you?" said Elf. "You must have got to know him well." "Him and his wife," said Calder. "They were a great couple." He thought about the unremarkable house at Banstead with its tiny flower garden in front and its rather larger kitchen garden at the back, both of which Michael Finnegan tended one-armed, hobbling down between whiles for a pint at the local. A respected man with many friends and acquaintances, none of whom knew that he was playing a lonely, patient, dangerous game. His articles in the papers, his casual contacts, letters to old friends in Ireland, conversations with new friends in the pub, all had been slanted towards a predetermined end. The fact was that the shape of the IRA's activities in England was changing, a change which had been forced on them by the systematic penetration of their English groups. Now, when an act of terrorism was planned, the operators came from Ireland to carry it out, departing as soon as it was done. They travelled a roundabout route via Morocco or Tunis, entering England from France or Belgium and returning by the same way. Explosives, detonators, and other materiel for the job came separately and in advance. Their one essential requirement was an operational base where materials could be stored and the operators could lodge for a few days needed for the job. It was to hold out his house as such a safe base that every move in Michael Finnegan's life had been planned. "We agreed," said Mr. Calder, "that as far as possible, Michael should have no direct contact of any sort with the security forces. What the department did was to lease a house which had a good view from its front windows of Michael's back gate. They installed one of their pensioners in it, old Mrs. Lovelock." "Minnie Lovelock?" said Alf. "She used to type for me 40 years ago. I was terrified of her, even then." All she had to do was to keep Michael's kitchen windowsill under observation at certain hours. There was a simple code of signals. A flower pot meant the arrival of explosives or arms. One or more milk bottles signalled the arrival of that number of operators. And the house gave us one further advantage. Minnie put it about that she had sublet a room on the first floor to a commercial gentleman who kept his samples there and occasionally put up there for the night. For the last year, the commercial gent was me. I was able to slip out after dark up the garden path and in at the back door. I tried to go at least once a month. My ostensible job was to collect any information Michael might have for us. In fact, I believe my visits kept him sane. We used to talk for hours. He liked to hear the gossip, all about the interdepartmental feuds and funny stories about the minister, and about the head of Special Branch. Oh, certainly. He particularly enjoyed the story of how two of your men tried to arrest each other. Elf grunted and said, "Go on." And there was one further advantage. Michael had a key of this room. In a serious emergency, he could deposit a message, after dark, of course, or even use it as an escape hatch for Sheila and himself. Did his wife know what he was up to? She had to be told something, if only to explain my visits. Our cover story was that Michael was gathering information about subversion in the docks. This was plausible, as he'd done an intelligence job in the Marines. She may have suspected that it was more than that. She never interfered. She's a grand girl. Elf said, "Yes." And after a pause, "Yes, that's really what I wanted to tell you. I've had a word with your chief. He agrees with me. This is a job we can't use you in." "Oh?" said Mr. Calder coldly. "Why not?" "Because you'd feel yourself personally involved. You'd be unable to be sufficiently dispassionate about it. You knew Finnegan and his wife far too well." Mr. Calder thought about that. If Fortescue had backed the prohibition, it would be little use kicking. He said, "I suppose we are doing something about it." "Of course. Superintendent Outram and Sergeant Fallows are handling it. They're both members of the AT squad and very capable operators." "I know Tom Outram," said Mr. Calder. "He's a sound man. I'll promise not to get under his feet. But I'm already marginally involved. If he wants to question Sheila, he'll have to do it at my cottage. I moved her straight down there as soon as I heard the news, gave her a strong sleeping pill and put her to bed." "They wondered where she'd disappeared to. I'll tell them she's living with you." "If you put it quite like that," said Mr. Calder, "it might be misunderstood. She's being chaperoned by Rasselas." "I think," said Superintendent Outram, "that we'd better see Mrs. Finnegan alone. That is, if you don't mind." He and Sergeant Fallows had driven out to Mr. Calder's cottage, which was built on the shoulder of the North Downs above Lamperdown in Kent. "I don't mind," said Mr. Calder, "but you'll have to look out for Rasselas." "Your dog?" "Yes, Mrs. Finnegan's still in a state of shock, and Rasselas is very worried about it. The postman said something sharp to her, not meaning any harm at all, and he went for him. Luckily, I was there, and I was able to stop him." "Couldn't we see her without Rasselas?" "I wouldn't care to try and shift him." Outram thought about it. Then he said, "Then I think you'd better sit in with us." "I think that might be wise," said Mr. Calder gravely. Sheila Finnegan had black hair and a white face, out of which looked eyes of startling Irish blue. Her mouth was thin and tight and angry. It was clear that she was under stress. When Outram and Fallows came in, she took one look at them and jerked as though an electric shock had gone through her. Rasselas, who was stretched out on the floor beside her, raised his head and regarded the two men thoughtfully. "Just like he was measuring us for a coffin," said Fallows afterwards. Mr. Calder sat on the sofa and put one hand on the dog's head. It took Outram 15 minutes of patient, low-keyed questioning to discover that Mrs. Finnegan could tell him very little. Her husband, she said, had suggested that she needed a break and had arranged for her to spend a week in a small private hotel at Folkestone. She wasn't sorry to agree because she hadn't really had a holiday in the last 3 or 4 years. Outram nodded sympathetically. Had the holiday been fixed suddenly, out of the blue like? Sheila gave more attention to this than she had to some of the earlier questions. She said, "We'd often talked about it before. Michael knew I had friends at Folkestone. But on this occasion, it was your husband who suggested it." How long before you left? 2 or 3 days. Then it was fairly sudden. Fairly sudden, yes. Did he give any particular reason? Had he had an unexpected message, something like that? He didn't say anything about a message. I wouldn't have known about it anyway. I was out at work all day. Outram said, yes, of course. There was nothing much more she could tell them. A quarter of an hour later, the two men drove off. As their car turned down the hill, they passed Mr. Behrens, who was walking up from Lamperdown. Mr. Behrens waved to the superintendent. "Looks a genial old cove," said Sergeant Fallows. "That's what he looks like," said Outram. When Mr. Behrens reached the cottage, he found Mr. Calder and Sheila making coffee in the kitchen. They added a third cup to the tray and carried it back to the sitting room, where Rasselas was apparently asleep. By contrast with what had gone before, it was a relaxed and peaceful scene. Mr. Calder tried the coffee, found it still too hot, put the cup carefully back on its saucer and said, "Why were you holding out on the superintendent?" "How did you know I was holding out?" "Rasselas and I both knew it." Hearing his name, the great dog opened one brown eye as though to confirm what Mr. Calder had said, and then shut it again. "If I tell you about it," said Sheila, "you'll understand why I was holding out." "Then tell us at once," said Mr. Behrens. "Of course I knew something was in the wind. I didn't know exactly what Michael was up to. He was careful not to tell me any details, but whatever it was he was doing, I realized it was coming to a head. That's why he sent me away. He said it shouldn't be more than 2 or 3 days. He'd get word to me as soon as he could. That was on the Friday. I had a miserable weekend, you can imagine. Monday came, and Tuesday, still no word. By Wednesday, I couldn't take it any longer. What I did was wrong, I know, but I couldn't help myself." "You went back," said Mr. Calder. He said it sympathetically. "That's just what I did. I planned it carefully. I wasn't going to barge in and upset all Michael's plans. I just wanted to see he was all right and go away again. He'd given me a key of that room in Mrs. Lovelock's house. I got there after dark. There's a clear view from the window straight into our kitchen. The light was on, and the curtains weren't drawn." As she talked, she was living the scene. Mr. Behrens pictured her, crouched in the dark like an eager theatre-goer in a gallery staring down onto the lighted stage. She said, "I could see Michael. He was boiling a kettle on the stove and moving about, setting out cups and plates. There were 2 other people in the room. I could see the legs of a man who was sitting at the kitchen table. Once, when he leant forward, I got a glimpse of him. All I could tell you that he was young and had black hair. The other was a girl. I saw her quite plainly. She was dark too, medium height and rather thin. The sort of girl who could dress as a man and get away with it. I got the impression somehow that they'd just arrived and Michael was bustling about making them at home. The girl still had her outdoor coat on. Maybe that's what gave me the idea. Just then I saw another man coming. He was walking along the road which runs behind our kitchen garden, and when he stopped, he was right under the window where I was sitting. When he opened the gate, I could see that he was taking a lot of trouble not to make any noise. He shut the gate very gently and stood there for a moment, looking at the lighted kitchen window. Then he tiptoed up the garden path and stood to one side of the kitchen window, looking in. That's when I saw his face clearly for the first time. Sheila was speaking more slowly now. Mr. Calder was leaning forward with his hands on his knees. Rasselas was no longer pretending to be asleep. Mr. Behrens could feel the tension without understanding it. Then he seemed to make up his mind. He went across to the kitchen door, opened it without knocking, and went in quickly, as though he was planning to surprise the people inside. Next moment, someone had dragged the curtains across. From the moment I first saw that man, I knew that he meant to harm Michael. But once the curtains were shut, I couldn't see what was happening. "You couldn't see," said Mr. Calder, "but could you hear?" "Nothing, on account of Mrs. Lovelock's television set in the room just above me. She's deaf and keeps it on full strength. All I could do was sit and wait. It must have been nearly an hour later when I saw the back door open. All the lights in the house had been turned out, and it was difficult to see, but Michael was between the 2 men. They seemed to be supporting him. The girl was walking behind. They came out and turned up the road. Then I noticed there was a car parked about 20 yards further up. They all got into it, and I went on sitting there. I couldn't think what to do. There was a moment of silence. Neither of the men wanted to break it. Sheila said, "I do realise now that I should have done something. I should have run down, screamed, made a fuss. Anything to stop them taking Michael away like that. But I didn't know what was happening. Going with them might all have been part of his plan." "It was an impossible situation," said Mr. Calder. "When you thought about it afterwards," said Mr. Behrens, "am I right about this? You got the impression that things had been going smoothly until that other man arrived, and that he was the one who upset things." "He was the one who gave Michael away," said Sheila. "I'm sure of it." There was a different note in her voice now, something hard and very cold. "I agree with Calder," said Mr. Behrens. "You couldn't have done anything else at the time. But as soon as you knew that things had gone wrong for Michael, why didn't you tell the police everything that you've just told us? Time was vital. You could give a good description of 2 of the people involved. Surely there wasn't a moment to lose." Sheila said, "I didn't go to the police because I recognised the man, the one who arrived on foot. I'd seen his photograph. Michael had pointed it out to me in the paper. I only saw him clearly as he stood outside the lighted window, but I was fairly certain I was right." She paused, then added, "Now I'm quite certain." Both men looked at her. She said, "It was Sergeant Fallows." The silence that followed was broken unexpectedly. Rasselas gave a growl at the back of his throat, got up, stalked to the door, pushed it open with his nose and went out. They heard him settling down again outside. "That's where he goes when he's on guard," said Mr. Calder. There was another silence. "I know what you're thinking," said Sheila. "You both think I'm crazy, but I'm not." It was Fallows. "Not an easy face to forget," agreed Mr. Calder. "And it would explain something that had been puzzling me. We'd taken such tight precautions over Michael that I didn't see how they could suddenly have known that he was a plant. He might eventually have done something or said something which gave him away. They might have got suspicious, but not certain, not straight away. It could only have happened like that if he was betrayed, and the only person who could have betrayed him was someone working in the squad." Mr. Behrens' mind had been moving on a different line. He said, "When they got into the car and turned the lights on, you'd have been able to see the number plate at the back, I take it." "That's right, I saw it, and I wrote it down. I've put it here. LKK 910P. Good girl. Now think back. When you were talking about the last man to arrive, you called him the one who came on foot. What made you say that?" Sheila said, "I'm not sure. I suppose because he came from the opposite direction to where the car was parked, so I assumed. I'm not disputing it. In fact, I'm sure you were right. Fallows wouldn't have driven up in a police car. He wouldn't even have risked taking his own car. He'd have gone by bus or train to the nearest point and walked the rest of the way." Mr. Calder said, "Then the car belonged to the Irish couple. Of course, they might have stolen it, like the one they left on the heath. They might, but why risk it? It would only draw attention to them, which was the last thing they wanted. My guess is that they hired it, just for the time they were planning to be here." "If you're right," said Mr. Calder, "there's a lot to do and not much time to do it. You better trace that car, and remember, we've been officially warned off, so you can't use the police computer. LKK is a Kent number. I've got a friend in County Hall who'll help. I'll look into the Fallows end of it. It'll mean leaving you alone here for a bit, Sheila, but if anyone should turn up and cause trouble, Rasselas will attend to him. In case there might be 2 of them," said Mr. Behrens, "you better take this. It's loaded. That's the safety catch. You push it down when you want to fire." The girl examined the gun with interest. She said, "I've never used one, but I suppose if I got quite close to the man, pointed it at his stomach and pulled the trigger, the results should be decisive," said Mr. Behrens. Fallows was whistling softly to himself as he walked along the carpeted corridor to the door of his flat. It was on the top floor of a new block on the Regent's Park side of Albany Street, and seemed an expensive pad for a detective sergeant. He opened the door, walked down the short hall into the living room, switched on the light, and stopped. A middle-aged man with greying hair and steel-rimmed glasses was standing by the fireplace, regarding him benevolently. Fallows recognised him, but had no time to be surprised. As he stepped forward, something soft but heavy hit him on the back of the neck. When he came round about 5 minutes later, he was seated in a heavy chair. His arms had been attached to the arms of the chair, and his legs to its legs by yards of elastic bandage wound round and round and round. Mr. Behrens was examining the contents of an attaché case which he'd brought with him. Mr. Calder was watching him. Both men were in their shirt sleeves and were wearing surgical gloves. "I think our patient's coming round," said Mr. Calder. "What the bloody hell are you playing at?" said Fallows. Mr. Behrens said, "First, I'm going to give you these pills. They're ordinary sleeping pills. I think 4 should be sufficient. We don't want him actually to go to sleep, just to feel drowsy." "Bloody hell you will." "If you want me to wedge your mouth open, hold your nose and hit you on the throat each time until you swallow, I'm quite prepared to do it, but it'd be undignified and rather painful." Fallows glared at him, but there was an implacable look behind the steel spectacles which silenced him. He swallowed the pills. Mr. Behrens looked at his watch and said, "We'll give them 5 minutes to start working. What we're trying," he turned courteously back to Fallows, "is an experiment which has often been suggested but never, I think, actually performed. We're going to give you successive doses of scopolamine dextrin to inhale, whilst we ask you some questions. In the ordinary sort of way, I have no doubt you'll be strong enough to resist the scopolamine until you become unconscious. There are men who have sufficient resources of willpower to do that. That's why we first weaken your resistance with a strong sedative. Provided we strike exactly the right balance, the results should be satisfactory. About ready now, I think." He took a capsule from a box on the table and broke it under Fallows' nose. "The snag about this method," he continued, in the same level tones of a professor addressing a class of students, "is that the interaction of the sedative and the stimulant would be so sharp that it might, if persisted with, affect the subject's heart. You'll appreciate, therefore, head up, Sergeant, that by prolonging our dialogue you may be risking your own life. Now then, let's start with your visit to Banstead." This produced a single, sharp obscenity. 50 minutes later, Mr. Behrens switched off his tape recorder. He said, "I think he's gone. I did warn him that it might happen if he fought too hard. And my God, did he fight," said Mr. Calder. He was sweating. "We'd better set the scene. I think he'd look more convincing if we put him on his bed." He was unwinding the elastic bandages and was glad to see that, in spite of Fallows' struggles, they had left no mark. The nearly empty bottle of sleeping pills, the half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a tumbler were arranged on the bedside table. Mr. Behrens closed Fallows' flaccid hand round the tumbler and then knocked it onto the floor. "Leave the bedside light on," said Mr. Calder. "No one commits suicide in the dark." "I've done a transcript of the tape for you," said Sheila. "I've cut out some of the swearing, but otherwise it's all there. There's no doubt now that he betrayed Michael, is there?" "None at all," said Mr. Behrens. "That was something he seemed almost proud of. The trouble was that when we edged up to one of the things we really wanted to know, an automatic defense mechanism seemed to take over, and when we fed him a little more scopolamine to break through it, he started to ramble." "All the same," said Mr. Calder, "we know a good deal. We know what they're planning to do and roughly when, but not how." Mr. Behrens was studying the neatly typed paper. He said, "JJ, that's clear enough. Jumping Judas. It's their name for Mr. Justice Jellicoe. That's their target, all right. They've been gunning for him ever since he sent down the Manchester bombers. I've traced their car. It was hired in Dover last Friday for 10 days. The man they hired it from told them he had another customer who wanted it on the Monday afternoon. They said that suited them because they were planning to let him have it back by 1 o'clock that day. which means that whatever they're going to do is timed to be done sometime on Monday morning, and they aim to be boarding a cross-channel ferry by the time it happens. They might have been lying to the man, said Sheila. Yes, they might have been. But bear in mind that if they brought the car back on Saturday afternoon or Sunday, the hire car firm would be shut for the weekend, and they'd have to leave the car standing about in the street, which would call attention to it. Now, I think they've got a timetable, and they're sticking to it. Which gives us 3 days to find out what it is, said Mr. Calder. If the payoff is on Monday, there are 2 main possibilities. Jellicoe spends his weekends at his country house at Witham in Essex. He's pretty safe there. He's got a permanent police guard and 3 boxer dogs who are devoted to him. He comes up to court on Monday by car with a police driver. All right, that's their one chance. They could arrange some sort of ambush, detonate one of their favourite long-distance mines. Not easy, though, because there are 3 different routes the car can take. This isn't the Ulster border. They can't go round laying minefields all over Essex. The alternative, said Mr. Behrens, is to try something in or around the law courts. We'll have to split this. You take the Witham end, have a word with the bodyguard. They might not know that we've been warned off, so they'll probably cooperate. I'll tackle the London end. Isn't there something I could do? Said Sheila. Yes, said Mr. Calder, there is. Play that tape over and over again, 20 times, until you know it by heart. There was something inside Fallow's muddled brain trying to get out. It may be a couple of words, even a single word. If you can interpret it, it could be the key to the whole thing. So Friday was spent by Mr. Calder at Witham, making friends with a police sergeant and a police constable, by Sheila Finnegan listening to the drug-induced ramblings of the man who'd been responsible for her husband's death, and by Mr. Behrens investigating the possibility of blowing up a judge in court. As a first step, he introduced himself to Major Baines. The Major, after service in the Royal Marines, had been given the job of looking after security at the law courts. He'd known Michael Finnegan and was more than willing to help. He said, "It's a rambling great building. I think the chap who designed it had a Rutarian palace in mind. Narrow windows, heavy doors, battlements and turrets, and iron gratings. The judges have a private entrance which is inside the car park. Everyone else, barristers, solicitors, visitors, all have to use the front door in the Strand or the back door in Carey Street. They're both guarded, of course. Teams of security officers. Good men, mostly ex-policemen. I was watching them for a time, first thing this morning," said Mr. Behrens. "Most people had to open their bags and cases, but there were people carrying sort of blue and red washing bags. They let them through uninspected. They'd be barristers or barristers' clerks, and they'd let them through because they know their faces. But I can assure you of one thing. When Mr. Justice Jellicoe is on the premises, everyone opens everything." "Which court will he be using?" Major Baines consulted the printed list. "On Monday he's in court number 2. That's one of the courts at the back, and I'll show you." He led the way down the vast entrance hall. Mr. Behrens saw what he meant when he described it as a palace. Marble columns, spiral staircases, interior balconies, and an elaborately tessellated floor. "Up these stairs," said Baines. "That's number 2 court, and there's the back door straight ahead of you. It leads out into Carey Street. So that anyone making for court number 2 would be likely to come this way. Not if they were coming from the Strand." "True," said Mr. Behrens. "I think I'll hang around for a bit and watch the form." He went back to the main hall and found himself a seat, which commanded the front entrance. It was now 10 o'clock, and the flow of people coming in was continuous. They were channeled between desks placed lengthways, and 3 security guards were operating. They did their job thoroughly. Occasionally, when they recognized a face, a man was waved through. Otherwise, everyone opened anything they were carrying and placed it on top of the desk. Suitcases, briefcases, even women's handbags were carefully examined. The red and blue bags, which Mr. Behrens decided must contain law books, were sometimes looked into, sometimes not. They would all be looked into on Monday morning. "It seemed pretty watertight to me," said Mr. Behrens to Sheila and Mr. Calder as they compared notes after supper. "Enough explosive to be effective would be bulky, and an elaborate timing device would add to the weight and bulk. They might take a chance and put the whole thing in the bottom of one of those book bags and hope it wouldn't be looked at. But they don't seem to me to be people who take chances of that sort. Could the stuff have been brought in during the weekend and left somewhere in the court? I put it to Baines. He said no. The building's shut on Friday evening and given a thorough going over on Saturday. Sheila and I have worked one thing out, said Mr. Behrens. There's a reference towards the end to fields. In the transcript, it's been reproduced as in the fields, and the assumption was that the attempt was going to be made in the country when Jellicoe was driving up to London. But if you listen very carefully, it isn't in the fields, it's in fields, with the emphasis on the first word, and there's a sort of crackle in the tape before it, which makes it difficult to be sure. But I think what he's saying is Lincoln's Inn Fields. They listened once more to the tape. Mr. Calder said, I think you're right. And it does explain one point, said Mr. Behrens. When I explored the area this morning, it struck me how difficult it was to park a car. But Lincoln's Inn Fields could be ideal. There are parking spaces all down the south and east sides, and the southeast corner is less than 200 yards from the rear entrance to the courts. Likely enough, said Mr. Calder, but it still doesn't explain how they're going to get the stuff in. Did you get anything else out of the tape, Sheila? I made a list of the words and expressions he used most often. Some were just swearing. Apart from that, his mind seemed to be running on time. He said midday and 12 o'clock a dozen times at least. And he talks about a midday special. That seemed to be some sort of joke. He doesn't actually use the word explosion, but he talks once or twice about a report or reports. Report? Said Mr. Calder thoughtfully. That sounds more like a shot from a gun than a bomb. It's usually in the plural, reports. Several guns. Rather elaborate, surely, hidden rifles, trained on the bench and timed to go off at midday. And it still doesn't explain how he get the stuff past the guards, said Mr. Behrens. He took the problem down the hill with him to his house in Lamperdown village and carried it up to bed. He knew from experience that he would get little sleep until he had solved it. The irritating thing was that the answer was there. He was sure of it. He had only to remember what he had seen and connect it up with the words on the tape, and the solution would appear as inevitably as the jackpot came out of the slot when you got 3 lemons in a row. Visualize the people pouring through the entrance into the building, carrying briefcases, book bags, handbags. One man had had a camera slung over his shoulder. The guard had called his attention to a notice prohibiting the taking of photographs in court. This little episode held up the queue for a moment. The young man behind, a barrister's clerk, Mr. Behrens guessed, had been in a hurry and had pushed past the camera owner. He hadn't been searched because he hadn't been carrying a case, but he had been carrying something. When Mr. Behrens reached this point, he did, in fact, doze off. So the solution must have reached him in his sleep. Next morning after breakfast, he telephoned his solicitor, catching him before he set out for the golf course. He said, when you go into court and have to tell the judge what another judge said in another case, quote a precedent, you mean? That's right. Well, do you take the book with you, or is it already in court? Both. There's a complete set of reports in court. Several sets, in fact. They're for the judges. And you bring your own with you. That might mean lugging in a lot of books. Trolleyful sometimes. Suppose you had, say, 5 or 6 sets of reports to carry. How'd you manage? I'll get my clerk to carry them in. All right, said Mr. Behrens patiently. How would he manage? If it was just a half-dozen books, he's got a sort of strap affair with a handle. That's what I thought I remembered seeing, said Mr. Behrens. Thank you very much. I suppose you've got some reason for asking all these questions? An excellent reason. His solicitor, who knew Mr. Behrens, said no more. We'll get there early, said Mr. Calder, and park as close as we can to the southeast corner. There's plenty of cover in the garden, and we can watch both lanes of cars. As soon as one of us spots LKK 910P, he tips off the others using one of these pocket radios. Quite easy, Sheila. Just press the button and talk, then let it go and listen. That doesn't sound too difficult, said Sheila. What then? Then Henry gets busy. Who's Henry? An old friend of mine who'll be coming with us. His job is to unlock the boot of their car as soon as they're clear of it. By my reckoning, he'll have 10 minutes for the job, which will be 9.5 minutes more than he needs." The man and the girl walked up Searle Street, not hurrying, but not wasting time, crossed Carey Street, climbed the 5 shallow steps and pushed through the swing doors and into the court building. Mr. Behrens had got there before them. He was standing on the far side of the barrier. A little queue had already formed, and he'd plenty of time to observe them. They had dressed for the occasion with ritual care, the man in a dark suit, cream shirt and dark red tie, the girl in the uniform of a female barrister, black dress, black shoes and stockings, with a single touch of colour, the collar points of a yellow shirt showing at the throat. As he watched them edge forward to the barrier, Mr. Behrens felt a prickle of superstitious dread. They might have been nervous, but they showed no sign of it. They looked serious and composed, like the young crusaders who, for the more thorough purging of the holy places, mutilated the living bodies of their pagan prisoners, like the novices who watched impassively at the auto da fe, where men and women were burned to the greater glory of God. Now they were at the barrier. The girl was carrying a book bag and a satchel. She opened them both. The search was thorough and took time. The man showed very slight signs of impatience. Mr. Behrens thought, "They've rehearsed this very carefully." When it came to the man's turn, he placed the 6 books held together in a white strap on the counter and opened the briefcase. The guard searched the briefcase and nodded. The man picked up the books and the case and walked down the short length of corridor to where the girl was standing. He ignored her, turned the corner and made for court number 2. Although it was not yet 10 o'clock, there were already a number of people in the courtroom. 2 elderly barristers were standing by the front bench discussing something. Behind them, a girl was arranging a pile of books and papers. The young man placed his 6 books, still strapped together, on the far end of the back bench and went out as quietly as he had come in. No one took any notice of him. A minute later, Mr. Behrens appeared, picked up the books and left. No one took any notice of him either. When the young man came out, he joined the girl and they moved off together. Having come in by the back entrance, it was evidently their intention to leave by the front. They had gone about 10 paces when a man stopped them. He said, "Excuse me, but have you got your cards?" "Cards?" said the young man. He seemed unconcerned. "We're issuing personal identity cards to all barristers using the court. Your clerk should have told you. If you come with me, I'll give you yours." The girl looked at the man, who nodded slightly, and they set off after their guide. He led the way down a long empty passage toward the western annex to the courts. The young man closed up behind him. He put his hand into a side pocket, pulled out a leather cosh, moved a step closer, and hit the man on the head. Their guide went forward onto his knees and rolled over onto his face. The young man and the girl had swung round and were moving back the way they'd come. "Walk, don't run," said the young man. They turned a corner and went down a spiral staircase which led to the main hall and the front entrance. When they were outside and circling the court building, the girl said, "That man, did you notice?" "Notice what?" "When you hit him. He was expecting it." "What do you mean?" "He started to fall forward just before you hit him. It must have taken most of the force out of the blow." Without checking his pace, the young man said, "Do you think he was a plant, holding us up so they could get to the car ahead of us?" "I thought it might be." The young man put one hand on the shoulder holster inside his coat and said, "If that's right, you'll see some fireworks." There was no one waiting by the car. The nearest person to it was a small man with a face like a friendly monkey who was sitting on a bench inside the garden reading the Daily Mirror. No one tried to stop them as they drove out of Lincoln's Inn Fields and turned south towards the embankment. 10:20, said the young man. "Good timing." They were 5 miles short of Dover, on the bare escarpment above Bridge, before he spoke again. He said, 12 o'clock. "Any time now?" Either his watch was fast, or the timing mechanism was slow. It was fully 5 minutes later when their car went up in a searing sheet of white flame. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. So let's say something about that story. So that was The Killing of Michael Finnegan by Michael Gilbert. Let me say something about him first. So Michael Gilbert was born in Billinghay, Lincolnshire in 1912, same year as my grandmother. I don't think they knew each other. He was educated at Blundell School and the University of London, where he read law. Important pointed for this story. His legal education was interrupted by the outbreak of World War II, during which he served in the Royal Horse Artillery. Gilbert was captured in North Africa in 1943 and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war in Italy, an experience that would later inform some of his writing. After the war, he completed his legal studies and was called to the bar in 1948. Gilbert maintained a successful career as a solicitor alongside his writing, eventually becoming a partner in the London law firm of Trower, Still and Keeling, or Trower, Still and Keeling. Gilbert's literary career began in 1947 with the publication of his first novel, Close Quarters. He went on to become a prolific author, penning 30 novels, numerous short stories, and several radio and television plays over the course of his career. His works span various subgenres of crime fiction, including police procedurals, there's a feel of that to this story, espionage thrillers, feel of that to this story, and courtroom dramas, guess what, there's a feel of that to this story. Gilbert was a founding member of the British Crime Writers Association and served as its chairman in 1988. He was also a long-standing member of the Detection Club, hard to say, of the Detection Club, serving as its president from 1988 to 1993. Throughout his career, Gilbert received numerous accolades for his contributions to crime fiction, including the Crime Writers Association Cartier Diamond Dagger for Lifetime Achievement in 1994. He continued writing well into his later years, with his final novel, The Queen Against Carl Mullen, published in 2002, when he was 90 years old. He passed away in 2006 at the age of 93, leaving behind a rich legacy in British crime fiction. Let's say about the story now. So, the publication details. It was published in August 1981 in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, an American periodical known for showcasing mystery and detective fiction, which is interesting because it seems a very British story. The publication was significant as this was Ellery Queen's was very esteemed and prestigious for short mystery fiction, and it featured both well-known authors and emerging authors. The story was later included in Michael Gilbert's short story collection, Mr. Calder and Mr. Behrens, published in 1982 by Hodder and Stoughton, as it turns out. This collection consists of several tales involving Gilbert's recurring characters, the counter-intelligence agents, Calder and Behrens. So these Mr. Calder and Mr. Behrens, it's interesting that they're Mr. and Mr., isn't it? They're almost like, it makes them a bit more shadowy, I think, forming a recurring duo in a series of short stories and novellas. And it blends, the story blends espionage and detective fiction, because this story read like a spy story, a counter-terrorism story, and also very much like a crime story as well. They feel like, they feel like coppers, or do they feel like spooks, or are they a little bit in the middle? So they're middle-aged, unassuming counterintelligence agents working for a shadowy branch of the British government. It's not specified which, whether it's MI5 or special branch. So they deal with cases that straddle domestic crime and international intrigue. There are very many, so what it says is that it challenges, my notes say, challenges many conventional tropes of spy fiction. They're not flashy or youthful and depend on their experience, intellect, and occasional ruthless pragmatism to handle intricate situations. I think spy fiction splits into two parts. There are the James Bonds and the Bourne Legacy and all that, and they're super duper super guys, and they'll be played by some flashy actor like Mission Impossible and the Superman, and they get all the girls. And then the other side is the dour, dismal, slightly depressed people that we see in Graham Greene and Le Carré. And these two fall in that side of things, the quiet American, the human factor, all the Smileys people and all of that stuff. I think when we look at it, where does that kind of strand of spy fiction come from? To me, it appears to have an evolution out of hard-boiled fiction. You remember we have the early detective fiction, and we have Sherlock. Let's say Sherlock Holmes. There are plenty of others, and then we have Poirot and people like that. And these are super brainy. They solve all the problems, and it's quite upbeat and cozy. And then we have hard-boiled, and these are morally dubious people living in a morally dubious world. Well, you can see the evolution of that into spy fiction of the second kind, even the first kind. Even James Bond is a morally ambiguous character. I don't know, he's obviously morally ambiguous. He's a narcissistic, womanizing psychopath. But we root for him, don't we? Well, you might not. I do, usually. And we root for these guys in a way, and we'll come to that in a minute. Maybe some of you didn't, and we'll come to that in a minute. Another evolution of detective fiction is, I've said this many times, in the early days, or not the very, very early days, I've just been doing a whole bunch of Victorian detectives, and you'll have followed that, and we've jumped forward. This is almost 100 years after those, and we can see how the genre has evolved. In those, the clues are solved by the brainiac detective, and we couldn't have solved them. And then there later came a convention in detective fiction in the first half of the 20th century that the clues should be there in plain sight, but hidden in plain sight by being de-emphasized, if you like. They're mentioned, but they're glossed over. They're there, so you don't get the Deus Ex Machina when you look back and go, oh, that's a swizz. How could I have worked that out? You go, oh, yeah. But, they're there, and sometimes they're just not there at all. So Sherlock Holmes pulls the rabbit out of the hat. Poirot, still does that. Miss Marple, they still do that. They pull the rabbit out of the hat, and you couldn't have solved it like them. And then later on, as I'm saying, in the first half of the 20th century, it becomes the convention whereby the clues are going to be there. They may be de-emphasized, but they're there, so you can solve them. This is there. This is like that. But even with those kind, I'm thinking of Agatha Christie, but there's plenty of others. And don't get me wrong, Agatha's great. We have the denouement at the end where the detective stands around and explains to all the stupid people how he's worked it out. What this story does is there is no denouement, except there is. Oh, what you talking about, Tony Walker? No, what I mean is nobody stands there. Old Behrens and Calder don't have a post-case meeting whereby they, and this, and this, which is the case of traditional detective fiction or earlier detective fiction. But we still work it out. The denouement's there. As soon as he picked up that that stack of books that had the bomb inside, we kind of knew what was going to happen because we knew he'd already said his mate, the smiling monkey man reading the Daily Mirror, is going to get into the boot of the car. That's, what do you call it in America? The trunk. And he's going to put the bomb back in there. So we know that's going to happen. And as soon as that happens, and particularly it can become more obvious when, the guy who takes the kosh at the back of the head and he ducks forward so as not to take the full blow. He's a brave man. I really wouldn't want to be koshed, even if I knew I was going to duck forward. It's touch and go whether you're going to get a fractured skull. But he does it. And as soon as that's happened, we're like, yeah, we know what's going to happen. The bomb has been switched. So he gives us a denouement. It's like, tell us what's going to happen without telling us what's going to happen. It's showing, isn't it? It's really good. Show, not tell. That's how he does it. And it's masterful, I think, in terms of the story, in terms of the structure of the story. It's masterful. So we get a dramatic irony effect. We know what's going to happen. The two IRA operatives don't know, but we know. Okay. The other tropes of spy fiction are betrayal. We've got that in spades here. And that's very classic in spy fiction. Let's talk about the British Irish political tensions in the early 80s. In the early 80s, there were bombs going off in London and in Birmingham and killing lots of people. Now, it is difficult even 40 plus years on, for British and Irish people to be dispassionate about this. And I steer clear in all these stories. I don't talk about race. I don't talk about gender. I don't talk about identity because this is a place you come for cozy stories. But Gilbert has placed this out there, and this is what the story's about. And I chose to do this story because I think it's a good story. So there are people, depending on which side you're on, there are people with deep, passionate feelings about this. All I would say was that this is a man who is thoroughly British, Michael Gilbert. He was in the British Army. He was at the centre of British establishment. It would be extremely difficult for him to be even-handed here, and he's not. What we see is Fallows is just a traitor. The two IRA operatives are basically fanatical murderers, yeah, and they get what they deserve in his world. I think, but if you were coming at it from an Irish point of view, you would be like, no, that's not how it is. And I think it would have been impossible for him to write this like this when, the bombs were going off in Brighton and London and Birmingham and Manchester. And people were being shot in Northern Ireland as well. It would have been difficult for him to write this, I'm saying that. But it would have been a far more nuanced story if we'd had some insight into why Fallows, because Fallows is given credit for having tough will and not giving in to torture. You've got to be tough not to give in to torture. I've never been tortured, but touching wood there. Everybody cracks, so they say. I'm sure they do. And he doesn't. So what is his motivation? And this isn't explored. And say if he'd given just a hint of motivation, say his grandfather was Irish, killed by the Black and Tans or something like that, that would have given us a more nuanced understanding of Fallows. And also, he gives credit to the professionalism, the cool-headedness, the determination of the two IRA operatives, but he doesn't give any idea of why they were motivated to do that. And I think if you were going to pick one side, so the British in the 1980s particularly, were saying they're just murderers. And Mrs. Thatcher said that, didn't she? They're just criminal murderers. And that, it seems to me that's a deep misunderstanding. And I don't think you can actually... it's like in South Africa, isn't it? The Truth and Reconciliation Committees. And in the Balkans, which it still isn't really resolved massively. But, you have to sit down with the people who hate you, who've killed your kin. And you have to begin from an honest place, really. So, and I think for both sides, that's really difficult. Not honest, but honest about your hatred, really. And then you can begin. Now, I'm just telling stories, but I think this is really difficult for him, impossible. Anyway, let's talk about something else controversial. Let's talk about Sheila. So Sheila is relegated to menial tasks and condescension. It's like mansplaining. Like, yeah, right, Sheila, this is the radio. You press the button, Sheila, and then you let go, and then you talk, okay? And Sheila's like, oh, okay. And there's the gun, right, Sheila? This is the safety. You take this off, and you just point it. Do you think you can manage that? Well, if he comes close and I just point it, yeah, of course, good girl. And all the women are girls, aren't they? So this is a guy born into the upper middle classes of a traditionally British society, born in 1912. Could he be other? It's very difficult to see how he could have different. But we are not him. We're talking many years later, and we're different people, and our society is different. And so we can look at his portrayal of the Anglo-Irish. There is no British Irish, you see. There's no word for that. Britanno-Irish? No, there isn't. Conflict, and we can have views that he couldn't have, and probably about gender as well. Because the other thing to say is, I read a story for the Ghost Story channel called In the Tube by Chetwynd Hayes. And that was set in the 80s, but it felt much, much older. And this, although it was published in 1981 and dealing with things that were very relevant in the 80s politically, but it feels it's an older style story, isn't it? And he wasn't. All of us, when we write about our past. So we write about a society that isn't the society we live in. Very rare that somebody writes about the society they're living in right now, unless they're 20 odd. But if you're an older person, you're probably inevitably going to be writing about a time when you were younger, which has the attitudes. And so it feels, I mean, 1981 was 44 years ago. That's a long time. But it feels like something out of the 60s, really, 65s, early 70s. And despite that, all of those caveats, not really caveats, but all of those observations, it is a really well done story, craft-wise, in terms of writing craft. And you can see how it straddles the spy and the detective. You can see how it is edging into modern thriller. Your typical modern thriller is tense, 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 cliffhanger, 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 revelation, morally ambiguous, and lots of technical details. I've been reading a few more modern books recently, and even, Frederick Forsyth going back to the 70s. I give him a lot of credit for this. He teaches you things. So modern thrillers will have little bits about Lebanese wines or how to can Coca-Cola, and you will learn things in them, and that is very much part of the modern thriller, how neoprene rope is made. And so we have that with the drugs, don't we? This Solpadol, whatever it is, that he gives him. Anyway, I thought it was a really good story. I think it raises some issues. And remember what I always say. If you hear or read a story and you are emotionally stirred up, that means the story's worked, because stories are emotion machines. They're two things, really. They're moral lessons and they're emotion machines. They manipulate our emotions, and that is how it works. And so if the story has done that to you, then it's worked. You may be fuming at this story. You may be cheering at this story. But either way, it's worked. And I hope you enjoyed it. That's the important thing.